So what I'll do today, through my own work over the last year, is talk about different aspects of development that all pertain to sustainable development. I'll start with climate, but I'll also talk about economic recovery, sustainable economic recovery. I'll talk about digitalization, which is much more about empowering younger generations and making the young demography more productive, right? Human insecurity, issues of equality of opportunities, multidimensional poverty, and things like that. I'll also talk about regional and global public goods, how so many of the problems that we talk about today transcend national borders. So even the mighty United States, with $20 trillion of GDP, 20% of the world output, cannot solve on its own. It needs those transboundary, transnational alliances. And finally, because of the way, the Westphalian structuring of the world into nation states, a lot of the things that we talk about are still bounded by the territorial sovereignty issues. So issues of national state capability also looms large. So all these 6 themes: climate emergency, economic revival, digitalization, human insecurity, regional and global public goods, and state capability, I will argue, are some of the more important or salient facets of the way we should be understanding sustainable development in today's terms. And as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the SDG goals, 1 to 17, and if you go into the targets, 169 targets, if you unpack that in terms of indicators, a lot of that actually can be mapped to many of the themes that I mentioned. If you want a higher level of aggregation, these 6 themes can also neatly be clustered into policy shifts that were accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, measures for improved human conditions, and different modes of governance. So I would argue that digitalization and a lot of the economic themes were policies that were accelerated by the pandemic. The measures for improved human conditions, this is really issues about human insecurity, multidimensional poverty, etc. And new modes of governance at the national, regional, and global levels. So I will touch on many of these themes, and I will be using my book. I don't think you can see this properly, but this is The Great Upheaval. This is published by Cambridge University Press early this year. I've just shared the link on the chat box. So you are welcome to freely download this and take a look at chapters that take your fancy or are of direct interest to your expertise. So of the 6 themes, let me start with the first one, which is on climate emergency. The main question we asked, I as a co-editor and working with this panel of distinguished authors, is how do we spur international action, especially through mobilizing sovereign finance? So the problem is of a transboundary nature. It's global in scope, but a lot of the mobilization of finance, or once you undertake many of those debt obligations, they have to be paid for by taxpayers in individual countries, right? So it's an issue of sovereign finance to solve a cross-national or a regional or even a global problem. So there are 2 chapters that I start with in this book on climate finance. The first one, just to motivate readers and to draw the attention of the world, we actually talk about the Himalayas. And to give credit to the wonderful work that ICIMOD has done, we've used a lot of the HIMAP evidence, the publication, a lot of the numbers cited there, we've drawn on that. And we've used basically the 3rd pole, the Himalayas, as exhibit A of climate change. And the most important point that we make there is, even if we were to cap global average temperatures at 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, glaciers in the region, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region, will lose 1/3 of their ice volume by the end of the century. That's a draconian prediction, partly contested from some quarters, but let's take that as it may. And if we prepare for the worst, which is, a lot of these glaciers feed into 10 major river systems across Asia, both on the northern side, southern side, southeastern side, supporting the livelihoods of almost 2 billion people. And a lot of these have implications for hydropower, clean energy generation, drinking water, irrigation, agriculture and food systems, and also flood control, which is a big issue from a humanitarian perspective every single year. There's also an issue of short-lived climate pollutants. So the greenhouse gas emissions, it's more global in scope, of course, and there is a global undertaking to reduce these. But something that we can act at a regional level is to do with the short-lived climate pollutants, the SLCPs, where we can force possibly a regional solution through regional institutions. We have a lot of complaints about SARC, but something of that nature would need to be much more effective. Then after making that strong case of why we should care about climate change by drawing on evidence from our own region, we then go on to tackle the earlier issue that I talked about. And the paradox and the puzzle here is, climate action requires very secure, very long-term financing. But the private incentives are often skewed towards short-term capital gains, right? And they are not at all designed. The global private capital system, the apparatus, is not at all. It's not equipped at all to deal with the longer-term risk-taking in physical investment. So if there are economists in the room, I would encourage you to read chapter 2 of the volume, where we go in some depth on how we might redress part of this challenge, which is rethinking capital account openness. So this is about gradually opening of capital accounts, which offers a key advantage because I don't want to go into the technical details, but this is about borrowing rates for physical projects that do not have to compete with short-term external financial returns. And countries like China have actually done this quite prudentially. There are issues about reforming regulatory and tax approaches to elicit greater climate finance. And one example of this is through feed-in tariff regimes or the upgrading of and construction and building standards and codes that are enforced by insurers. There's a third issue of green and SDG bonds or debt for nature swaps, right? After COVID, a lot of countries have borrowed heavily. One medium-term solution to all this is to write off many of these debt in return for tangible, credible, medium-term, long-term commitments to conserve better a lot of the natural habitats and reduce carbon emissions. There's also an issue of voluntary debt buybacks. These are all financial instruments that we can reorient towards solving the climate puzzle. And there's the issue of SDRs, the special drawing rights, the special currency that the International Monetary Fund issues, and many heads of states have actually called for new issuance of SDRs through the International Monetary Fund to the tune of, let's say, 500 billion or even $1 trillion over a period of 10 to 20 years that should be applied or that should be made available as climate finance. So these are all interesting, innovative proposals from the perspective of finance, because ultimately, until you have money, you can't invest in these in this area to really solve that puzzle of sovereign finance, but an international conundrum of climate finance, which even has an existential challenge to all of us, right? So this is the first topic that I want to just highlight. The second issue, again, on another facet of sustainable development, but broadening it slightly beyond its natural realm, is on economic revival. Now, the question we ask here is, how do we pursue inclusive growth, especially after the pandemic, against the backdrop of what I call 4 Ds? Now, the first D is declining productivity. The second D is deglobalization. A lot of countries are now looking inwards. Third D is growing debt. And the fourth D is a region that is fast depopulating, the demographic angle, right? So how do we revive our economies, create jobs for young people, pursue inclusive growth after the worst calamity in a century, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, against the backdrop of all these headwinds that are holding you back, that are pulling you back, right? So that's, so in a couple of chapters, I think 2 or 3 chapters, economic-oriented chapters, we deal with those themes. I'll just touch on some major takeaways. what we've noted is East Asian and South Asian countries urgently need to revisit their growth strategies to break through what I call productivity glass ceilings. And many of these countries have made wonderful progress over the last 30, 40 years, but they're now stuck in this middle income trap, right? So you need to be adopting, not just replicating or mimicking what the Western countries did in the 20th, early part or the mid part of the 20th century. We need a completely different strategy altogether. Given the climate threat that we face, given the fast evolving technologies that we're looking at, and some new policy shifts, which is forcing many of the even the more capable, the stronger economies in our region, the Chinas and the Indias, to deindustrialize at levels of income much lower than what was attained by advanced industrial countries, right? So if you look at metrics such as how many people among your total workforce are engaged in manufacturing, for example, we see that the Korea started to slow down only after peaking at about 27, 28% in the 1980s. The United States, a famous example, peaked at almost 30% of manufacturing employment, of total employment in 1953. Yet you look at countries like, big countries like China and India, fast catching up, doing pretty good economically otherwise, yet deindustrializing at levels of 13%, 14%, and then suddenly moving into these low-end services sectors. So, but what we argue is manufacturing remains a special sector. We can realize increasing returns to scale. It exhibits unconditional convergence in labor productivity. It's able to absorb a large workforce, all this youth bulge that is coming to the economies, and it can cater to demand unconstrained by the small domestic size of your market. So you could be a Singapore, yet or a Hong Kong, and yet serve the world in garments as it did in the 70s and the 80s. But then you climb up the ladder, right? So this is an important point that we make, that all those opportunities are being constrained by the new policy regimes, but also the way technology, policy shifts, demography, all these things are interacting with each other. So there's a chapter where we look at East Asia versus Latin America, and I would encourage you to look at those papers and draw some insights there. And we give some historical perspective. We refer to the Plaza Accord in 1985, when Japan was the big threat in the world economy, as seen from a Western lens, and how a lot of those production issues were managed at the time, and how manufacturing systems organized around Japanese conglomerates were reshuffled across the rest of Asia, which enabled this process of catch-up in the rest of Southeast Asia. What next now, in the aftermath of COVID, against these looming threats that we face? We need to move up the ladder, but the nature of the ladder is slightly different. What can that be? What is it? What are these new patterns that we're seeing? So this is also a theme that we cover. There's a lot of discussion, very rich discussion on global value chains. So 70 to 80% of world production is now organized through multinational companies locating parts of their production. It's called global fragmentation of production, or global production networks, or international production networks, or more commonly as global value chains, although people tend to confuse this with something that you see within your national borders. There's the honeybees feeding into, this agro-processing kind of thing at a very localized level. It is also called a value chain, but the global value chain that I'm referring to is basically much broader. This entire global production paradigm that is organized around these multinational companies located in multiple locations. Now, we saw that this model is possibly under threat when we saw that the PPEs or even the vaccines were not being delivered on time. And there was a discussion early on during the pandemic that maybe this whole GVC paradigm is failed. But I argued, and we as a team of authors argued, that it would be premature to diagnose a wholesale failure of the GVC paradigm. And we argued that the pandemic experience was actually unusual. This period of great upheaval was unusual because normally when one part of the world is hit by an adverse shock, there's another part of the world that sort of compensates or rebalances. COVID-19 was unique in the sense that all these country level shocks were correlated with each other. So in that regard, this was an idiosyncratic shock and quite irregular, and we were not able to diversify risk the way the GVCs are designed to serve. right? So this is what we argue, that but the other shocks that we'll face in the future, the GVC paradigm, the global value chain paradigm, this fragmentation of production model is actually a good thing, because Economics 101 teaches us that to diversify risks, you need to invest in alternative multiple portfolios. Right? But what we did actually agree with was on the public sector resources to come in much more strongly to maintain strategic reserves, inventories of critical equipment, and forward-looking purchase agreements between governments and these private multinational locations. So we argue that global value chains actually remains a viable strategy. Again, from a perspective of sustainable growth, sustainable development, this remains an important strategy for countries like Nepal and Afghanistan, and which are still laggards in South Asia. And the rise of the services economy with accompanying digitalization and automation, while pose a challenge, but they also bring new opportunities. But states need to invest much more in human capabilities. And we also argue that the low labor costs represent a source of competitive advantage, and increasing incomes necessarily undermines that. And therefore, it is all the more important that we invest in more skilled labor, skill-based labor market. So there's some nuanced discussion on global value chains as a continuing source for sustainable growth and development into the future, especially when we ask this important question: where are the new jobs coming from? What are those new sources of economic growth into the future? Right. The third topic is on digitalization. Right here, the question we ask is, how do we secure universal access of digitalization? But that's not just it, right? Access is only part of the story. How do we ensure affordability? How do you generate content? And how do you expand digital literacy in ways that support these new sources of job creating growth? So it's a very important point. And the point we make in the book is that there are new digital ambitions which should reflect where the technology is going, not where the technology is today or where it was a decade ago. But there are all these techno-regulatory hurdles. This is where the political economy angles come in. A lot of these utilities, telecom companies, regulatory authorities are often sources for rent-seeking and corruption in many of these countries. So states often don't let go. But we need that competitive environment in this sector so that prices can be lowered, and these hurdles that I mentioned, techno-regulatory hurdles, can actually be resolved to achieve universal, affordable broadband access. And this is where, when you talk about access, the problem of the last mile comes, which we know, remote locations, fragile locations, and all that. But it's also the more invisible mile. So not just the last mile, but the invisible mile also needs to be factored in. And what do we mean by that? This is where the technological options exist, but we also need both the private and the public sector to finance this universal expansion. The International Telecom Union, ITU, estimates, for example, that we need almost $430 billion per year over the next 10 years. Now, all countries should have funded national broadband strategy, and they must act on data collection, broadband definition, pro-competition policies, spectrum policies, and universal service goals. And this is where we make this point that but access is just one part of the puzzle. The content, pricing, etc., needs to be factored in much more aggressively to tackle digital inequality. So the fourth theme, again, another facet of sustainable development writ large, but very important in this post-pandemic literature development discourse, is on human insecurity and inequalities. So has the pandemic reaffirmed the importance of a standing social protection architecture to provide a secure buffer against transient shocks and systemic deprivation? Why is this question important to countries like us in the region? Well, we used to think, even I, when I was a student of economics in the early days, used to think, all this stuff on the environmental front, on basic social protection or universal floors of social protection, this is something that you do when you become rich. Reach a decent middle income status, $5,000, $6,000 per capita, then you can afford to talk about these other things. Otherwise, when you are poor, when you are so poor, all you need to focus on is getting that growth process going, those physical capital formation incentives to be aligned with your larger goals. And these are things that you postpone until you are rich. This is partly challenged with the human development paradigm. In the 1990s, Amartya Sen, Mahbub al-Haq, and others challenged this quite strongly. And now this has become a global consensus. But a new learning has come after the COVID-19 literature, and which is broadly accepted by the mainstream development fraternity now, which is that even at low levels of income, you should be going for a universal social protection regime, right? So this is where, and why did this lesson come? Formal sector workers were well covered, but it was the informal sector workers that fell through the cracks. And a lot of that increase in poverty, something that we have been working towards very positively over the last 30 years, especially with the rise of populous middle income countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, that did wonderfully in reducing large number of poverty. During COVID, that went down, right? So the pandemic exposed the fragility of such development achievements that actually were accrued over decades. So the new learning, the policy insight was governments must play a proactive role in enhancing capabilities, building agency, and promoting human security to protect people against downside risks. So this could be a basic package of, let's say $15 per person per year, in proportion to your country's economic wherewithal, right? The size of your economy, the size of your state coffers, size of your tax base, and all that. And the reason we made this case was high income alone cannot guarantee health security, right? So this is where multidimensional poverty indices that we visited, new insights that came into the picture were taken on board to make this case for a universal system. But all this cannot happen in a vacuum. You need a dynamic growth process to get those taxes coming, to get those jobs and youthful employment covered through the employers themselves, which is very much the case, especially in the American countries that follow the American system, is a lot of your health insurance and security actually comes through virtue of your affiliation with your employer. That is not quite the case in Europe. But the point we make here is even if you are a low-income country, and India is actually a trailblazer in this regard. So you can criticize Prime Minister Modi for many things that we may disagree with. But on the social protection architecture, I think there's some interesting large-scale experiments that many other developing countries should be looking into as well. Now, in this discourse on human insecurity, there's often a discussion of equality that comes together, and with Thomas Piketty and Branko Milanovic and others really putting the inequality discourse in the center of the global development debates. Even the SDG 10 is frontally on inequality. But here, there's been some progress, right? So we used to use the traditional Gini measure to measure inequality across societies. We made a slight progress. We found that Gini was actually not very good at capturing inequality at the extremes, at the top and the bottom. So the PALMA index, for example, was also introduced, even in the case of Nepal when we did the Sustainable Development Roadmap. But I believe conceptually we need to move even a step ahead of that, right? Not just these quantitative measures, but even conceptually, I think we should be highlighting, if we really care about sustainable development, sustaining gains well into the future, about equalizing not outcomes, not development outcomes, but equalizing opportunities, right? So this is where I think there are three categories that we need to look into, and this is what we cover in the book also. There are three categories of inputs that determine fairness, right, in society. So the first is about choices. So that's really the effort that you and I as individuals put in on whatever we do, on the decisions of where to work, etc. The second set is about circumstances. You don't have too much control over it, right? These are factors relevant for success, but you and I don't choose that. So this is about which family we are born into, which country we are born into, what ethnicity, what religion we're born into, right? So irrespective of the parental status, ethnicity, or gender, these are circumstances that do affect how well you end up doing in life, but you really didn't have any say. I didn't choose to be born in this mountain village in Gorkha, but I was born there, right? So these are circumstances that are very important. Now, individuals, so this is a conceptual philosophical argument, that individuals should be held accountable for their choices, but not their circumstances, right? And the role of public policy, the role of sustainable public policy, sustainable development-oriented public policy should be to blunt the effect of circumstances while amplifying the relative importance of choices, the individual effort, the individual aptitude, the individual work ethic that all of us have or accrue through our lifetimes, because all that impinges on individual success, on income, on education, on health, etc. So we actually propose a new way to measure equality of opportunities by using detailed household survey, etc. And the person I had on board on this was John Romer from Yale University, who is, for an American, a little bit of a left-wing thinker, but a tenured, very well-respected economist, philosopher at Yale, who's been writing about this topic since the 90s, but nobody took notice. But after the pandemic and after the global financial crisis, I think these issues have become important, and I'm very happy that I've got his core contribution in the book. So folks who are interested along these lines are encouraged to consult that relevant chapter. So let me cover, I'm mindful of time, so let me cover two more themes. The fourth theme is on the provisioning of regional and global public goods. The question we ask is, why are they inadequately provisioned? Why are they not provided to the extent that there is demand for them? And what concepts, what institutional arrangements, and what cooperation strategies do we need to rethink for an overhaul? Now, there was a time, I remember myself, 2006, just before the onset of the global financial crisis, there was a move to actually defund the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, because the issues of global financial stability had, taken a back burner, assumed a back burner position. People thought this problem has been solved. And then the world was hit by a financial contagion that started in the United States, but quickly propagated to the rest of the world. And you needed an institution like the IMF to restore order, financial order in the world. So its size actually ended up becoming very big. Just before the COVID pandemic in 2019, there were calls to actually starve the WHO, the World Health Organization. And many countries were very hesitant in funding it properly, right? And then pandemic hit and you realized that it's not just China's problem. It's not just America's problem. It's not just Germany's problem. It's the world's problem. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Then you realize that these global institutions were so indispensable. As they used to say of the UN, you may complain all you want about the UN, but if an institution of that nature didn't exist, you would have to create one. Right? So the regionalism, talk a little bit about the Asian success stories. So this is again after the global regional financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis in 1997. We experimented with some regional instruments. So Chiang Mai currency swap. There's some effort to reduce disaster risks and all that. But the regional cooperation definitely, is not happening to the extent. ASEAN fares better than South Asia, but still, not to the extent that a lot of the sustainable development challenges of today demand, right? This could be the issue of SLCPs that I alluded to. Okay, global greenhouse gases, it's a global problem through COPE mechanism and the UNFCCC, you're doing all that. But what about regional solutions on safe use of new technologies, on migration, on pandemics, on air pollution, regional air pollution, and all that? So this issue of providing regional public goods to solve sustainable development challenges is very important. Kishore Mahbubani, this famous Singaporean diplomat, head of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, has a very simple line. He says, the world has changed, but our way of managing the world has not changed, right? So this is why we need global public goods, which require a renewed conception, replacing power politics with a primary operating principle of mutual compatibility between international cooperation and sovereignty. So all these issues, partly conceptual, partly philosophical, but also very pragmatic. A lot of that is there in a chapter on global public goods and also on regionalism. So I encourage you to look at that. And the new argument that we make there is to solve all these new problems of sustainable development. We need to define global public goods as a new type of policy challenge that is quite radically different from official development assistance, right? And we need to adopt a mission-oriented approach to solve many of these things. And the classic test of all that was COVID-19 vaccines. Technically, from an economic perspective, they were not global public goods, because to define something as a public good, it needs to be non-excludable and non-rival. So vaccines was not exactly that. But we also argued there that if you produced vaccines in abundant quantities, then so that access would not be non-rivalrous, then you can treat it like a global public good. So the big question that we asked there is, while multilateral efforts were insufficient and bilateral aid came late, why were regional initiatives largely non-existent So by asking these hard-hitting questions, you then, it prompts you to look for answers and solutions. But we proposed certain, as I said, conceptual issues and pragmatic ways to move forward. Now, finally, and to me, probably one of the most important themes in this whole sustainable development puzzle to meet the SDGs, etc., is national state capability. And here, what we draw a lot on the issue of the evidence drawn from the COVID-19 pandemic itself, right? And here we look at issues like trust, issues like social capital, kind of intangible stuff that is quite hard to measure, quite hard to grapple with. That proved critical in pandemic response. And what else did we learn about adaptive governance, right, to solve these big problems? I think there are 2 chapters in the book which deal with these issues. And the trigger, my own interest in this topic was, if you look at the just before the vaccines came on into use, if you look at the fatalities and infections, the United States and Netherlands and the United Kingdom did much worse than countries like Thailand or Vietnam or Japan or even Rwanda, right? And here the issue of social capital, institutions, trust in authority, all that played a role. So I already had a hypothesis on why these differing fatalities and infections were being evident, even though in terms of sophistication of their health systems, sophistication of equipment. So you can, the Western countries were way ahead. And just before the pandemic, Johns Hopkins, famous for their public health expertise, had done this health security index, where all the countries that I mentioned earlier had ranked number 1, number 2, number 3, and countries like Thailand and Vietnam and Rwanda were way down the list.